Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle and this is World Book Day. So in today's video, I want to introduce you to 4 decades of historical mystery openings. I think the opening of a mystery is really important, and I think everybody has a preference to how they like a story to open. So I'm going to read you the opening from 4 different historical mystery books, and they are each from a different decade, so that you can see what the openings were like and maybe how they changed over the years. But what I would like to know is, what do you prefer? What kind of opening do you like, especially in a historical mystery? So we are going to start with Elizabeth Peters' Crocodile on the Sandbank. This is the first in the Amelia Peabody series, and this book was written in 1975. So this is a historical mystery opening from the decade of the 70s. When I first set eyes on Evelyn Barton Forbes, she was walking the streets of Rome. I am informed by the self-appointed critic who reads over my shoulder as I write that I have already committed an error. In those seemingly simple English words, if those seemingly simple English words do indeed imply that which I am told they imply to the vulgar, I must in justice to Evelyn find other phrasing. In justice to myself, however, I must insist that Evelyn was doing precisely what I have said she was doing, but with no ulterior purpose in mind. Indeed, the poor girl had no purpose, and no means of carrying it out if she had. Our meeting was fortuitous, but fortunate. I had, as I have always had, purpose enough for 2. I had left my hotel that morning in considerable irritation of spirits. My plans had gone awry. I am not accustomed to having my plans go awry. Sensing my mood, my small Italian guide trailed behind me in silence. Piero was not silent when I first encountered him in the lobby of the hotel, where, in common with others of his kind, he awaited the arrival of helpless foreign visitors in need of a translator and guide. I selected him from amid the throng because his appearance was a trifle less villainous than that of the others. I was well aware of the propensity of these fellows to bully, cheat, and otherwise take advantage of the victims who employ them, but I had no intention of being victimized. It did not take me long to make this clear to Piero. My first act was to bargain ruthlessly with the shopkeeper to whom Piero took me to buy silk. The final price was so low that Piero's commission was reduced to a negligible sum. He expressed his chagrin to his compatriot in his native tongue, and included in his tirade several personal comments on my appearance and manner. I let him go on for some time, and then interrupted with a comment on his manners. I speak Italian, and understand it quite well. After that, Piero and I got on admirably. I had not employed him because I required an interpreter, but because I wanted someone to carry parcels and run errands. My knowledge of languages and the means which enabled me to travel abroad had been acquired from my late father, who was a scholar and antiquarian. There was little else to do but study in the small country town where Papa preferred to live, and I have an aptitude for languages, dead and alive. Papa preferred his languages dead. He was a devoted student of the past, and emerged from it only occasionally, when he would blink at me and express surprise at how I had grown since he last noticed my existence. I found our life together quite congenial. I'm the youngest of 6, and my brothers, being considerably older, had left the nest some time before. My brothers were successful merchants and professional men. One and all, they rejected father's studies. I was left then to be the prop of my father's declining years. As I have said, the life suited me. It allowed me to develop my talents for scholarship, but let not the gentle reader suppose that I was ill-equipped for the practical necessities of life. My father was disinclined toward practicalities. It was left to me to bully the baker and badger the butcher, which I did, if I may say so, quite effectively. After Mr. Hodgkins the butcher, Piero gave me no trouble. So that's the opening to Crocodile on the Sandbank by Elizabeth Peters. This is from 1975. And so with this opening, you get the impression right away that this is a slightly humorous historical mystery. What is not clear from the opening is the exact time period that this historical mystery takes place. You'll have to continue reading in order to find that information. This is also the type of opening that, rather than going straight into action and dropping you right in the middle of the story, other than the very first sentence about how she met someone in Rome, it starts with the backstory and letting you know who the character is and what her situation is. So that's the opening from 1975. Let's move to the 80s. This is Satan in St. Mary's by Paul Doherty, or P.C. Doherty. And this one was written in 1986. So let's find out how this one opens. Introduction. A savage, cold wind had sprung up just after dark. It stirred and rippled the black waters of the Thames, hit the moored ships and sent them moving and straining at their ropes. The decaying corpses of 3 river pirates twisted and twirled in the wind to the creak of the scaffold overhead. Ghostly dancers grimly turning to macabre music. The wind pierced the alleys and rutted tracks of the city, freezing the mud and odor, driving deeper into the darkness those human predators of the shadows who might still be hunting for any unfortunate abroad on such a dark and miserable night. The church of St. Mary Le Beau stood alone and desolate, its carved brick and woodwork open to the wind. The cemetery which surrounded it whispered and murmured with sounds as leaves and branches were scornfully cast around by the wind as it bent and shook the flimsy wooden crosses of the dead. Inside the church, it was cold and dark. The wind slammed close a loose shutter and then continued to play its distant, eerie music in the cracks and crevices of the crumbling masonry. The place was deserted and quiet, except for the scurrying patter of the occasional rat and the slow dripping of rainwater through a tear in the roof as it trickled down the mildewed wall, forming a green, dank puddle at its base. In the sanctuary, before the high altar, a man sat bolt upright in the blessed chair. His soft, plump hands clutched the carved wood as if he was reassuring himself that as long as he sat in that chair he had found sanctuary and was protected by all the power, temporal and spiritual, of the church. Yet he was afraid, his large protuberant eyes staring into the darkness, searching for them, wondering if they would come. He had sinned grievously in being one of them. He had sinned grievously in killing one of them, and they would not forget that. Nor would God. The man's fingers felt the carved letters which ran along the arms of the chair. Hic est terribilis locus. This is a terrible place, the house of God where angels walked and worshipped before the white body of Christ. Yet here too he had sinned, most horribly, committed an abominable act in the hope it would ease his terror and despair. He thought of the knife which had brought him here. It had slipped so easily into the soft throat of the man. Like something from a dream, he remembered it going in, soft and smooth like a spoon into cream. He had not meant to do it, yet it was done, and now he was a murderer, a fugitive from the king's justice, and from something much more terrifying. He jumped as a bird or bat was driven by the wind into one of the long shuttered windows above him. He stared up deep into the dark alcove, and then, hearing a faint sound from the far end of the church, he turned his head back slowly, feeling the hair on the nape of his neck rise in horror at what it might be. They had come, standing with a torch spluttering above them. They seemed to have emerged, hooded and cloaked from the darkness. They stood, a group of black, evil crows, in the pool of light thrown by their torches, and then began to move soundlessly toward him. The man moaned in terror and sank deeper into the chair, oblivious to the hot wetness between his fat thighs. His hands gripped the wood, his head fast against the back of the chair as his eyes darted to and fro. There must be, surely, he thought, some way of escape from the hell advancing toward him. He wanted to run, but he could not move. Perhaps the wine? If only his legs and arms were not so heavy. he could escape the terrors now approaching him. So that was the opening to Satan in St. Mary's by P.C. Doherty from 1986. This one opens right away with action, and you get someone is told of a murder and you get hints of murder. And so even though it's not overtly given, you do get an idea of the time period that this historical mystery is set. Let's move to the 90s with A Test of Wills by Charles Todd. This was published in 1996, and let's see how this one opens. Chapter 1. In this quiet part of Warwickshire, death came as frequently as it did anywhere else in England. No stranger to the inhabitants of towns, villages, or countryside. Sons and fathers had died in the Great War. The terrible influenza pandemic had scythed the country, man, woman, and child, just as it had cut down much of Europe, and murder was not unheard of, even here in Upper Streatham. But one fine June morning, as the early mists rose lazily in the warm sunlight like wraiths in no hurry to be gone, Colonel Harris was killed in cold blood in a meadow fringed with buttercups and cowslips, and his last coherent thought was anger. Savage, wild, black fury ripped through him in one stark instant of realization before oblivion swept it all away, and his body, rigid with it, survived the gunshot blast long enough to dig spurs into the mare's flanks while his hands clenched the reins in a muscular spasm as strong as iron. He died hard, unwilling, railing at God, and his ragged cry raised echoes in the quiet woods and sent the rooks flying even as the gun roared. In London, where rain dripped from eaves and ran black in the gutters, a man named Bowles, who had never heard of Colonel Harris, came into possession of a piece of information that was the reward of very determined and quite secret probing into the history of a fellow policeman at Scotland Yard. He sat at his desk in the grim old brick building and stared at the letter on his blotter. It was written on cheap stationery in heavy ink by a rounded, rather childish hand, but he was almost afraid to touch it. Its value to him was beyond price, and if he had begged whatever gods he believed in to give him the kind of weapon he craved, they couldn't have managed anything sweeter than this. He smiled, delight spreading slowly across his fair-skinned face and narrowing the hard, amber-colored eyes. If this was true, and he had every reason to believe it was, he had been absolutely right about Ian Rutledge. He, Bowles, was vindicated by 6 lines of unwittingly damaging, girlish scrawl. Reading the letter for the last time, he refolded it carefully and replaced it in its envelope, locking it in his desk drawer. Now the question was how best to make use of this bit of knowledge without burning himself in the fire he wanted to raise. If only those same gods had thought to provide a way. But it seemed, after all, that they had. 24 hours later, the request for assistance arrived from Warwickshire, and Superintendent Bowles happened, by the merest chance, to be in the right place at the right time to make a simple, apparently constructive suggestion. The gods had been very generous indeed. Bowles was immensely grateful. The request for Scotland Yard's help had arrived through the proper channels, couched in the usual terms. What lay behind the formal wording was sheer panic. The local police force, stunned by Colonel Harris's vicious murder, had done their best to conduct the investigation quickly and efficiently, but when the statement of one particular witness was taken down and Inspector Forrest understood just where it was going to lead him, the Upper Streatham Constabulary collectively got cold feet. At a circumspect conference with higher county authorities, it was prudently decided to let Scotland Yard handle this situation, and to stay out of the Yard's way as much as humanly possible. Here was one occasion when metropolitan interference in local police affairs was heartily welcomed. With undisguised relief, Inspector Forrest forwarded his request to London. The Yard, in its turn, faced a serious dilemma. Willy-nilly, they were saddled with a case where discretion, background, and experience were essential. At the same time, it was going to be a nasty one either way you looked at it, and someone's head was going to roll. Therefore, the man sent to Warwickshire must be considered expendable, however good he might be at his job. And that was when Bowles had made his timely comments. So that's A Test of Wills by Charles Todd. An example of a historical mystery opening from the 90s. This one drops you right into the action where you get the murder of Colonel Harris. And then you get introduced to the detectives in London. So this one goes straight into the action. However, from the very first couple of lines, you are also told when this story takes place without being obvious and just flat out saying this is the date. You learn that this takes place shortly after the First World War. So let's move to the 2000s. And this is a historical mystery from 2007, Her Royal Spyness by Rhys Bowen. Chapter 1. Castle Rannoch, Perthshire, Scotland, April 1932. There are two disadvantages to being a minor royal. First, one is expected to behave as befits a member of the ruling family without being given the means to do so. One is expected to kiss babies, open fates, put in an appearance at Balmoral, suitably kilted, and carry trains at weddings. Ordinary means of employment are frowned upon. One is not, for example, allowed to work on the cosmetics counter at Harrods, as I was about to find out. When I venture to point out the unfairness of this, I'm reminded of the second item on my list. Apparently, the only acceptable destiny for a young female member of the House of Windsor is to marry into another of the royal houses that still seem to litter Europe, even though there are precious few reigning monarchs these days. It seems that even a very minor Windsor like myself is a desirable commodity for those wishing a tenuous alliance with Britain at this unsettled time. I am constantly being reminded that it is my duty to make a good match with some half-lunatic, buck-toothed, chinless, spineless, and utterly awful European royal, thus cementing ties with a potential enemy. My cousin Alex did this, poor thing. I have learned from her tragic example. I suppose I should introduce myself before I venture any further. I am Victoria Georgiana Charlotte Eugenie, daughter of the Duke of Glengarry and Rannoch, known to my friends as Georgie. My grandmother was the least attractive of Queen Victoria's daughters, who consequently never managed to snare a Romanov or a Kaiser, for which I am truly grateful, and I expect she was too. Instead, she was hitched to a dreary Scottish baron who was bribed with a dukedom for taking her off the old queen's hands. In due time, she dutifully produced my father, the second duke, before succumbing to the sort of diseases brought on by inbreeding and too much fresh air. I never knew her. I never met my fearsome Scottish grandfather either, although the servants claim that his ghost haunts Castle Rannoch, playing the bagpipes on the ramparts. Which in itself is strange, as he couldn't play the bagpipes in life. By the time I was born at Castle Rannoch, the family seat even less comfortable than Balmoral, my father had become the second duke and was busy working his way through the family fortune. My father, in turn, had done his duty and married the daughter of a frightfully correct English earl. She gave birth to my brother, looked around at her utterly bleak Highland surroundings, and promptly died. Having secured an heir, my father then did the unthinkable and married an actress, my mother. Young men like his uncle Bertie, later King Edward VII, were allowed, even encouraged, to have dalliances with actresses, but never to marry them. However, since mother was Church of England and came from a respectable, if humble, British family at a time when the storm clouds of the Great War were brewing in Europe, the marriage was accepted. My mother was presented to Queen Mary, who declared her remarkably civilized for someone from Essex. So that's the opening of Her Royal Spyness by Rhys Bowen from 2007. So I find this interesting to look at the openings of one book from each of the decades from the 1970s until the 2000s. And 1975 and 2007 had similar openings in that they introduced the main character first. In Her Royal Spyness, they make it very clear right from the beginning. They just lay it out for you where it is and what time period it takes place. Castle Rannoch, Perthshire, Scotland, 1932. And you get introduced to Georgie, who is the main character for this series. I find it interesting that this book and this book are both written in the first person by that main character, and these books are also both slightly humorous, and so you get this style of opening. Now, Crocodile and the Sandbank does not make clear right from the beginning the time period, but they're both first person and they're both slightly humorous, and the opening spends more time introducing you to the main character rather than dropping you into the action. Satan in St. Mary's by P.C. Doherty from the 80s and A Test of Will by Charles Todd from the 90s are both historical fictions that drop you right into the action. They start with the murder. And this is the style of opening that I think I prefer in a historical mystery. I like to be dropped right into the action and then have the main character introduced and the time and the place introduced after that. What do you prefer? What type of opening do you like in a book? Specifically a mystery. What's your preferred opening? Let me know down in the comment section down below. I love to chat about books, and I'll see you for another video soon. Bye.